Gris tells the story of a girl who has, presumably, lost her mother, and with it, her voice and much of her will to live. This is deftly communicated throughout the game, not through dialogue, which is completely absent throughout the narrative, but wholly by character acting. Now, I originally played this game within an educational context wherein I only had a single day to blitz through the game. As a result, the slow nature of the character's movement, despite being the primary method of storytelling, was lost upon me due to time constraints. As a result, I was left with an almost tainted view of the game, making me question what the proper balance between art and playability truly is. Upon further reflection, however, and extensive time to think about and play the game on my own time, I've come to realize that there really isn't a proper balance in a general sense, but rather a proper balance to suit your narrative, the story that the developers want to tell. When conversations relating to artfulness in video games come up, I love to bring attention to the Nier franchise, citing the strategic balance between engaging hack-and-slash combat and meticulously crafted stories requiring conscious thought and appreciation. In many cases, I cite Nier Replicant's side quest, The Ballad of the Twins, wherein the player brings together Devila, who's usually seen performing in the village's tavern, with her sister Popola, who routinely sings on the water fountain. Upon doing so, the player receives a reward, as is the case with many side quests. Where Nier deviates from the standard RPG, and gaming tropes in general, is exactly what that reward is. Rather than something tangible, the player gets to witness a beautiful duet between the two sisters. With this comes a choice. Do you continue on with the game and the story, or do you sit and wait, enjoying the tranquility of the moment? The key word here is choice. For a game like Nier, a hack-and-slash RPG which focuses on nuanced yet repetitive storytelling, granting oneself the opportunity to witness this duet is a choice. Further, the player's actions after the duet begins are another choice. In each of these individual moments, you, the player, are in control. Certainly, the game is well aware of how special and unique this moment is, but it is wholly optional, and doesn't particularly ask anything of the player. Did you do the side quest? Cool, here's your reward, do what you want with it. I believe that this comparison, essentially comparing apples to oranges, in addition to time constraints, is what originally soured me on Gris. Gris, unlike Nier, is asking the player to appreciate what they've created. Whereas Nier told its story primarily through fully voice-acted cutscenes and a myriad of expository dialogue, Gris lacks both of these. However, there is still a very clearly defined narrative in the latter. But what exactly is that mode of storytelling, and is it effective? Gris tells its story primarily through its scenery and character acting. The pacing, then, matches this. From the slow crawl of the main character rising from her knees and stumbling through the desert, to the quick swan dive she performs after causing flowers to bloom with her sonorous voice. The segmentation of each area and the rising complexity of them match the processing of grief as the character proceeds through the world. As color returns, so too do positive aspects of her mental well-being, ultimately culminating in a final meeting with her mother following a slow, treacherous climb up a fragmented statue. In this scene, the character kisses her mother farewell and is fully processed and grieved through her trauma. Now, do I think the game is perfect? No, not by a long shot. But I also think that it's not a game meant for everyone, and promotes a playstyle suited for one's own pacing. Many of the criticisms levied against it are what provide it with narrative substance. Among these are monotonous pacing, simplified mechanics, and tedium. But really, what would Gris, a game about processing grief through artful depictions, be without monotony, especially when dialogue is off the table? What would Gris, a game about overcoming grief, be without the building of complexity as the main character comes to terms with her loss? What would Gris be without the negative aspects attributed to it? Simply put, it would no longer be Gris. There are many games that deal with narrative beats relating to the processing of grief, with the most well-known of these definitely being the Last of Us franchise. And while I love the titles, they are similarly marred with monotonous pacing, such as slow dialogue scenes as Joel and Ellie find unorthodox ways to navigate the apocalyptic streets. Similarly, there are moments where the game forces its players to witness moments of serenity, such as the first title's iconic giraffe scene, yet these same critiques aren't levied against it. One has to question why that is. While I don't necessarily have any conclusive answers, a very large part of me would like to say that the character's motions don't necessarily convey this. For the most part, the game attempts to perform a pseudo-balancing act wherein moments of slow reflection are disrupted by scenes of action. Again, however, this proper balance is only achieved due to the narrative that's being told, and the medium in which it's conveyed. A third-person shooter with large amounts of dialogue can easily convey these moment-to-moment scenes through character back and forths, even during the monotony of moving a ladder across a street to climb into an open window. When an individual character who has literally lost her voice does the same, however, Gris's elected substitute is through environmental storytelling, through color, scenery, character progression, and abilities. Now, I won't sit here and say that one method is more effective than the other, as they are both saying and doing different things despite the narrative through line of grief maintaining parity. What I will say, however, is that both games ask for different things of their player base, and The Last of Us's method clearly targeted a much broader and popular mode of play, whereas Gris's more experimental, slow burn playstyle requires patience and willingness to stick with the game. Another critically received title is What Remains of Edith Finch, a walking simulator that details how Edith and her now deceased family members process grief. However, no one complains about the monotony of Edith Finch for simply being a walking simulator with slow pacing and simplified mechanics. Again, one must ask, why is this? While it may seem like a simple answer, that being, because it's a walking simulator, it reveals exactly why these complaints are raised against Gris. Simply, it becomes an issue of expectations. What does one expect when they play a walking simulator? They expect de-emphasized gameplay, they expect narrative focus, they expect monotony and tedium. What does one expect then from a 2D platformer? Engaging level designs, challenging moment-to-moment gameplay from point A to point B, a simple storyline that serves the gameplay, and not the other way around. Now, what we got with Gris instead is more akin to the former than the latter, despite the fact that it branches the 2D platformer title. I would posit then, that if people approached it from the perspective of a slightly more involved and demanding walking simulator, then it wouldn't have received nearly as much backlash as it did, which, in all fairness, it still reviewed incredibly well. Further, whereas walking simulators such as Edith Finch typically have some level of narration, Gris is totally absent of this, which, again, forces us to rely solely on visuals. So, we've hopefully gotten to the root of the issue as to why Gris could be seen as contentious, owing to the fact that its gameplay and storytelling methodology are closely intertwined in a way that not many other games are, making it more akin to a walking simulator during the first half of the game, and a more proper 2D platformer in the latter. But really, it seems like all I've done is talk about why Gris has to be the way it is, with very little praise as to how it benefits from it. Simply put, the themes of the game permeate throughout each and every interaction, each environment, each ability that the character gains. Whereas a title like The Last of Us deals with similar narrative beats, the gameplay itself isn't what influences it, the dialogue is. A title like Edith Finch isn't involved to the extent that Gris is, and instead conveys grief solely through narrative. Nier features beautiful moments, but scenes like Devil and Popola singing aren't the focus of the game. Gris itself is a portrayal of grief. Every aspect of it conveys the main character's emotions and her journey. No moment is wasted in this portrayal, and this results in a level of friction between the player enjoyment and narrative cohesion. Is it a fun game? That, of course, is up to the player, but on the whole, I don't believe that fun is what the developers wanted to convey for a majority of the title. By the end of the game, when the main character has come to terms with her mother's passing, and you're diving in and out of water, singing to cause flowers to blossom and soaring towards the skies from said flowers, that is when the game is meant to be fun. Because, really, that's when the game's main character is happiest. As a caveat, however, I need to clarify that fun and enjoyment are wholly different. Fun, as I'm using it in this context, is simply the level of enjoyment relating solely to the gameplay, whereas I define enjoyment as the positive emotional response elicited by a game on the whole. For example, I don't typically look to Gris as a game that I find fun, but I can readily turn around and say that I enjoyed it. Conversely, I can look at something like Assassin's Creed Odyssey and say that I had fun, but that I didn't truly enjoy it. Games like Nier and The Last of Us, while performing a balancing act between fun and artful storytelling, strive to achieve their proper balance in gameplay fun and narrative. Games like Gris, respectively, have their own proper balance that highlights narrative over fun, which is in no way inferior to the former. Games, realistically, don't require a proper balance between fun and engaging gameplay and artfulness. Compounding on this, even if there is a proper balance, there isn't any binary that these games can fit into categorically. Each game requires its own uniquely crafted gameplay and story, and everything that comes with it, including a fitting score and sound design, with each supporting the other to craft an experience that's more than the sum of its parts. Drawing upon the games that I've already mentioned, those being Nier Replicant, and the franchise on the whole, The Last of Us, What Remains of Edith Finch, and of course Gris, I believe that each of these games do so in their own individual ways. Nier's proper balance is by demanding focus on the cutscene-based stories, delivering artfulness through both subtleties in subsequent playthroughs and thought-provoking side quests. The Last of Us breaks its monotony through engaging cover-based shooting, with narrative highlights occurring during said monotony. What Remains of Edith Finch places all of its eggs in the artfulness basket, but we only expect artfulness from a walking simulator, something that it expertly achieves by intertwining vivid scenery with a chillingly deep narrative. Lastly, Gris's gameplay is its narrative, but the gameplay itself is fairly de-emphasized to the point where narrative and artfulness are what truly shine. Video games are, first and foremost, games. They are deeply interactive, personal experiences that differ from any other narrative experiences such as movies and books because of this level of interactability. And with this interactability comes the necessity and unique expression for gameplay. Gameplay, when coupled with engaging narratives, can create something truly special. Each of the games that I've highlighted has synthesized gameplay in unique ways to cultivate an enriching experience that promotes narrative engagement through a variety of approaches. Whether that's by making these moments of art optional, or by largely separating them from the gameplay, Nier and The Last of Us stand to exemplify how these games can be so compelling while telling completely original stories. What Remains of Edith Finch, as a walking simulator, fosters engaging narrative through its de-emphasis on actual gameplay, but still highlights interactivity through the act of walking through these scenes in a way that movies and books simply don't allow. In this way, Gris can, and should, be looked at similarly to What Remains of Edith Finch, despite our expectations of a 2D platformer. The game's narrative comes first, and the gameplay second, where the latter serves the former, inverse to most modern titles, but ultimately, it evolves into a fast-paced and vertical sprint resembling what one would typically expect of the genre, expertly mirroring the game's storytelling structure. There is no proper balance between gameplay and artful narrative, only a balance suiting the story that the developers want to tell. In this way, I found that each of these titles greatly benefits from their different creative directions. Whereas I initially felt very neutral and maybe even slightly antagonistic towards the game, I've come to learn and appreciate Gris for what it is and what it does so uniquely and masterfully.